Hello, my name is Will and this is a video about HaxeFlixel. In this video I want to introduce you to HaxeFlixel, explain what it is, and give you a little bit of information about how it works. Disclaimer, I went to school for illustration and design and I am a self-taught programmer. I learned a lot through trial and error, and although I will try to be as accurate as possible, there may be a few gaffes, so I invite anyone to correct me. Any corrections will be added with annotations, so I encourage you to watch the video with annotations on. If you're new to programming, please try not to be intimidated. Anything we go over in this video that might go over your head will be covered in detail later in the future. And by immersing yourself now, you'll already have a bit of a ground to stand on by then. This tutorial uses the following. More on these later. So, HaxeFlixel is a free open source framework for creating 2D games. It's easy to learn, easy to use, and it has a ton of built-in tools. It's very game jam friendly. It's built and maintained by a great community of developers and game designers, and it compiles to Flash, HTML5, Windows, Mac, Linux, Android, iOS, and if you're feeling extra saucy, even BlackBerry. But how does it work? In a nutshell, when you create a new project with HaxeFlixel, the first thing that you do is create a new Flix game. A Flix game is basically the image on which all of your game is projected onto. When you create a new Flix game, you also initialize a class called FlixG. The G is short for global, and there are a lot of helpful variables and functions in this class. You can quickly reference your game's width and height using FlixG, for example, and it even sets up a default camera. When you're creating a new Flix game, you'll also have to tell HaxeFlixel which Flix state you'd like to start the game with. A Flix state can be a number of things, like a main menu or a level of your game. If you're familiar with Unity, you can also think of Flix state as a scene. If you're familiar with GameMaker, it's like a room. You populate your Flix state with Flix objects. These will be all sorts of things, like your player sprite or a tile map. More on those in a minute. First, let's go back to Flix states. Every Flix state has two important functions, create and update. Create runs when you first load a Flix state. It's where you initialize the state. You can also add Flix objects to the state here. One important thing to be aware of is the way Flixel layers graphics on top of one another. Objects are layered in the order of which they are added to the Flix state. This means if I add a red rectangle to my state, and then I add an orange circle, the circle will appear to be on top of the red rectangle to the player. The update function runs every frame of your game. That means if your game is running 60 frames per second, all of the code in update will happen 60 times every second. All of the logic for your game loop will run in this update function, and the update functions of your other Flix objects. For instance, if you want to bump two objects together, you'll use FlixG collide to check if their hitbox are touching. If you want to check to see if two objects' hitboxes are overlapping, you would use FlixG.overlap. Here's a very simple example of a Flix state. This is the whole class. It's called newState. This chunk of code tells our game exactly what classes we're using and from what library they're pulled from. Here are some variables, player and tiles. Here's the create function for the new state. In it, we've initialized the state as well as our two variables, player and tiles. After they're initialized, we're adding them to the state. As you might notice, we've added the player object before adding the tiles object. This means that the player will appear behind the tiles. This could be exactly what we want, but if our tiles include a blue sky instead of a transparent background, our player object will be hidden behind the tiles. Here's our update function. In this update function, we're merely checking to see if the player is colliding with our tile map. Right now this would be a pretty boring game, but after a few more lessons you'll be able to make something a lot more interesting. A Flix object can be any number of things. A Flix sprite is a Flix object with a graphic attached to it. It has a lot of graphical functions like the ability to create animations from a sprite sheet. A Flix tile map is a Flix object that can be used to render a tile-based level. Flix text is an easy way to render text to your game, and a Flix particle has all the same functions of a Flix sprite, but it includes some extra behaviors to better suit particle effects. Every Flix object has a ton of useful variables. We'll get into a bunch of them later on in the series. Like a Flix state, Flix objects have two very important functions. Similar to create, a Flix object's new function, or constructor, runs when you create a new Flix object. There are some important distinctions between new and create, but we won't get into that now. In a Flix object's new function, you will be initializing your object, and if it happens to be a Flix sprite, you'll be adding your graphics and animations as well. In a Flix object's update function, you can have some game logic pertinent to that object. If you have a more complex Flix sprite, you can have the logic controlling the animations here. And if you're creating a playable character, you'll also want to have your controller logic here as well. Similarly, you could also create any AI logic here for NPCs and enemies. Here's an example of a controllable player character. This is the entire class. At the top of this chunk, you can see that the player class is a Flix sprite. This means that it inherits all of the abilities and variables of a Flix sprite. And here again, we have the classes we're importing. This is the new function for our player character. As you can see, I'm initializing it, attaching a graphic, and adding animations here. Then I'm doing a few other things. I'm telling HaxeFlixel when to flip the graphic of the character, and I'm adding a constant vertical acceleration to serve as gravity for the player. This is the player's update function. In this section, I have all my controller logic. If I press left, the character will face left and move left. If I press right, the character will face right and move right. And if I press the spacebar while the player is touching the ground, the player will jump. In the next section, I have the animation logic. If the player is not touching the ground, I want it to always play the jump animation. Otherwise, the player will either be playing the idle animation if it's not moving horizontally, or it will play the walk animation if it is moving horizontally. That's it for this character. It has animations, gravity, can walk, and jump. You can see that it doesn't take a lot of work to get a simple game working quickly in HaxeFlixel. The last thing I'd like to mention in this lesson are Flix Groups. For now, you can think of a Flix Group as a collection of Flix objects. For instance, you could use it to group all of your enemies together. You could also add Flix Groups to other Flix Groups. A Flix state is actually a Flix group. There are tons of utilities for Flix Groups. For instance, you could use them to layer objects in a Flix state. It also makes checking for collisions and overlaps much more simple. For instance, if you were checking to see if the enemy's bullets are overlapping the player, instead of typing out flixg.overlap for every bullet, you could just check for overlaps between a group of bullets and the player. There's so much more to cover, and in the next few lessons, we'll actually begin coding and exploring HaxeFlixel more in depth. To follow along, you'll want to have HaxeFlixel installed. I won't be going very in depth here, but I will touch on what you'll need. First, you'll need all the dependencies for HaxeFlixel. You'll need to download the Hax Toolkit, Lime, and OpenFL, and HaxeFlixel itself. You'll also need an IDE, or Integrated Development Environment. This will be the tool in which you write all of your code. If you're using Windows, I recommend Flash Develop or Hax Develop. If you use Mac or Linux, I recommend Sublime Text. You'll also want to have a debug Flash player. HaxeFlixel compiles to a lot of targets, but it compiles to Flash player very quickly, so this is a must-have. You'll also want a set of tools to create the assets for your game. Most of your art and audio will have to be created outside of HaxeFlixel, and there is a world of software for the creation of both. Some of this software can be very expensive. Neither Photoshop nor FL Studio, the two programs listed here, are free. Luckily, there are tons of programs that are cheap, free, open source, and very specialized. We'll talk about more of these in the future, but you should use whatever you want. If you need more help getting started with the setup of HaxeFlixel, go to HaxeFlixel.com and click on Getting Started to learn more. Developers in the HaxeFlixel community have even started work on a tool that makes this whole process extremely easy. And this tool may even be ready by the time I post this video. Check the description for a link. That's it for now. I hope you have a better idea of what HaxeFlixel is and how it works. In the next lesson, we'll start making a game. Thank you for watching. Please feel free to leave any feedback in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, please consider supporting my Patreon. It will enable me to create more videos like this. Patrons get early access to all of these videos, as well as access to secret bonus tutorials. I'd like to thank Gamma11 for his help in proofreading the script and slides for this video. It was a great help. See you next time.